had always bought and sold stuff my entire life, and then my dad opened up a small coin shop when I was 16. I worked with him, and then together we opened up a secondhand shop, and then we opened up a pawn shop. So it's all I've ever done. I enjoy doing it.
The Las Vegas County Courthouse buzzed with activity on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning. Among the crowd of attorneys in tailored suits and anxious defendants awaiting their fate sat Rick Harrison, the world-famous owner of the gold and silver pawn shop and star of Pawn Stars. Unlike his usual confident demeanor on television, today Rick appeared tense, his eyes fixed on the courtroom doors. This wasn't a routine business matter or a simple permit issue. Rick was facing a lawsuit that threatened not just his reputation, but the very existence of his family's pawn empire. The case seemed straightforward at first glance. A customer claimed Rick had knowingly purchased a stolen Civil War-era sword, allegedly worth over $200,000. The plaintiff, Harold Dempsey, a wealthy collector with connections throughout Las Vegas, insisted Rick had deliberately undervalued the historical artifact, paying just $15,000 before selling it to a museum for 10 times that amount. With his expensive legal team and compelling story, Dempsey had already won public sympathy. Local news outlets had run the story for weeks, portraying Rick as a cunning businessman who had taken advantage of someone's ignorance. As Rick entered the courtroom, whispers followed him. Most people assumed the TV personality would have arrived with an entourage of high-powered attorneys. Instead, Rick carried only a worn leather briefcase filled with documents he had gathered himself. When asked by reporters where his legal team was, Rick had simply replied, "Today, I'm representing myself." This decision had caused an uproar among legal experts, who called it professional suicide and the ultimate reality TV star ego trip. Even Rick's family had begged him to reconsider. Judge Miranda Holbrook was known throughout Nevada for her no-nonsense approach and particular distaste for celebrities who expected special treatment in her courtroom. As she entered and took her place at the bench, her eyes immediately fell on Rick with unmistakable skepticism. When she learned he would be representing himself, she made little attempt to hide her disdain. "Mr. Harrison," she began, barely concealing a smirk, "the court recognizes that you may be an expert in pawned merchandise, but this is not a pawn shop. This is a court of law. Are you certain you wish to proceed without legal counsel?" Rick stood, his expression calm despite the judge's thinly veiled mockery. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe I'm the best person to defend myself in this matter." A few chuckles spread through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Judge Holbrook shook her head slightly, already anticipating the disaster about to unfold. "Very well, Mr. Harrison. Don't expect any special accommodations because of your television fame." Rick nodded respectfully. "I expect to be treated like anyone else, Your Honor." As the proceedings began, Harold Dempsey's attorney, Amanda Wells, a partner at one of Las Vegas's most prestigious law firms, presented their case with practiced precision. She displayed photographs of the Civil War sword, detailed its provenance and extraordinary value, and painted Rick as a shrewd businessman who had used his expertise to take advantage of an unwitting seller. "Mr. Harrison knew exactly what he was purchasing," Wells argued confidently. "His entire career is built on identifying valuable items that others miss. He deliberately misled our client, claiming the sword was a replica when he knew it was authentic." Throughout Wells's opening statement, Rick remained silent, taking occasional notes and studying the documents before him. His apparent calmness stood in stark contrast to the gravity of the accusations against him. When it was finally Rick's turn to make his opening statement, Judge Holbrook sighed audibly, as if preparing herself for an amateur display. "Mr. Harrison, you may now present your opening statement. Please try to stick to relevant legal arguments." The condescension in her tone was unmistakable. What happened next shocked everyone in the courtroom. Rick stood, adjusted his glasses, and began speaking not with the casual, straightforward style known from his TV show, but with the measured, precise language of someone intimately familiar with legal proceedings. "Your Honor, opposing counsel has presented a compelling narrative, but it is just that, a narrative unsupported by facts and contradicted by evidence I intend to present today." His voice was steady, his terminology exact, as he outlined 3 key points that would dismantle the plaintiff's case. First, Rick explained, he would demonstrate that the provenance documents provided by the seller, Mr. Dempsey's cousin, were not merely incomplete, but deliberately falsified. Second, he would prove that he had conducted appropriate due diligence before the purchase, including consulting with 2 independent experts who had deemed the sword likely to be a period reproduction, not an authentic Civil War-era weapon. Finally, and most significantly, Rick stated that he would show that Mr. Dempsey himself had attempted to sell the same sword to 3 other collectors before approaching Rick's shop, and had been turned down each time due to questions about its authenticity. As Rick spoke, the expression on Judge Holbrook's face gradually shifted from dismissive amusement to genuine surprise. This was not the bumbling reality TV star she had expected. The legal precedents Rick cited were relevant and accurately applied. His understanding of the burden of proof was clear. When he finished his opening statement by requesting the case be dismissed on the grounds that the plaintiff had filed in bad faith, knowing the sword was a reproduction, the courtroom fell silent. "Mr. Harrison," Judge Holbrook said, her tone markedly different, "I must say I'm surprised by your grasp of legal procedure. Where exactly did you acquire this knowledge?" Rick's response was humble but confident. "Your Honor, before I owned a pawn shop, before there was any TV show, I spent 15 years dealing with legal contracts, regulations, and occasionally lawsuits related to pawn transactions. I've represented myself successfully in court 3 times before, and I've studied business law extensively to protect my shop. This isn't my first time in a courtroom, just my first time in yours." The judge nodded slowly, reassessing the man standing before her. "Very well. Let's proceed with the evidence." What followed was a masterclass in self-representation. Rick methodically presented documents, witnesses, and expert testimony that systematically dismantled the plaintiff's case. He cross-examined Harold Dempsey with a precision that made even Amanda Wells look uncomfortable, exposing inconsistencies in his story and ultimately revealing that Dempsey had purchased the sword knowing it was likely a reproduction, hoping Rick's shop would mistake it for an original. Rick's first witness was Dr. Eleanor Chambers, curator of Civil War artifacts at a prestigious East Coast museum. "Dr. Chambers, could you explain to the court how you determined this sword was not an authentic Civil War officer's sword?" Rick asked after establishing her credentials. The expert's testimony was clear. Certain manufacturing techniques visible in the metal were not consistent with Civil War-era production. Furthermore, the pattern of wear didn't match genuine battlefield use, but appeared to be artificially created, something a museum curator could recognize but the average person might not. Next, Rick produced documentation showing that Dempsey had attempted to sell the sword to 3 other collectors before approaching the gold and silver pawn shop. Each potential buyer had declined after raising concerns about authenticity. "Your Honor," Rick explained, "Mr. Dempsey didn't choose my shop because he thought we would pay a fair price. He chose us because he hoped we wouldn't catch what these other collectors had already identified as problems with the sword's authenticity." The most damning evidence came when Rick called Dempsey's cousin to the stand, the original seller who had brought the sword to Rick's shop. Under Rick's careful questioning, the man admitted that Dempsey had coached him on what to say, provided him with falsified provenance documents, and promised him a percentage of any lawsuit winnings. "He told me all I had to do was act like I didn't know what it was worth," the cousin testified, visibly uncomfortable. "He said Rick Harrison would lowball me, and then we could sue for the difference." As the case unraveled, Judge Holbrook's initial skepticism had completely disappeared. She watched Rick navigate complex evidence rules with surprising expertise, objecting at appropriate times, and responding to opposing counsel's objections with correct legal reasoning. During one particularly effective cross-examination, the judge actually nodded in approval at Rick's technique, a gesture not lost on the now nervous plaintiff and his increasingly frustrated attorney. By the lunch recess on the second day, whispers filled the courthouse. Legal observers who had come expecting to witness a celebrity's humiliation were instead watching a masterful self-defense. Local attorneys who had initially mocked Rick's decision to represent himself were now taking notes on his methods. One was overheard saying, "Harrison could teach our firm's associates a thing or two about courtroom presence." When Amanda Wells attempted to introduce last-minute evidence, photographs supposedly showing the sword in Dempsey's family photos from the 1920s, Rick calmly objected on grounds of improper disclosure and authentication. "Your Honor, Not only was this evidence not shared during discovery as required by Nevada Rules of Civil Procedure 26A, but I would argue that these photographs appear to have been digitally altered. He proceeded to point out several inconsistencies in the images that suggested manipulation. Judge Holbrook sustained his objection, visibly impressed by his attention to detail. For his closing argument, Rick did something unexpected. Rather than focusing solely on the legal arguments that had served him so well, he spoke directly about the principles that had guided his business for decades. Your Honor, in the pawn business, trust is everything. My shop has survived for over 30 years because we deal honestly with people. We make mistakes sometimes, we're human, but we never deliberately undervalue items or mislead our customers. He continued. Mr. Dempsey came to my court? Excuse me, your court. This drew a small smile from Judge Holbrook, hoping to use my public profile against me. He assumed that because I'm on television, a jury would believe I act like a character, not a businessman with ethical standards. The evidence has shown that this entire case was built on deception, from the falsified provenance to the coached testimony. The only person who misrepresented anything in this transaction was Mr. Dempsey himself. When Rick finished, the courtroom was silent. Judge Holbrook studied him for a moment before turning to Amanda Wells for her closing arguments. The once confident attorney seemed deflated, her closing statement full of generalizations and emotional appeals, rather than the strong evidence she had promised at the beginning of the trial. When she attempted to pivot back to Rick's celebrity status, suggesting that his TV fame gave him an unfair advantage in negotiations, the judge's expression made it clear this argument was falling flat. After brief deliberation, Judge Holbrook returned with her ruling. This court finds in favor of the defendant, Rick Harrison, she announced clearly. Furthermore, I am granting Mr. Harrison's countersuit for legal expenses and referring Mr. Dempsey to the district attorney's office for investigation of potential fraud charges. She paused, then added something unusual for the typically reserved judge. Mr. Harrison, I must acknowledge that I made an incorrect assumption about your legal abilities at the start of this proceeding. You have conducted yourself with professionalism and demonstrated exceptional legal acumen. This court stands adjourned. As Rick gathered his documents, Judge Holbrook approached him privately. Mr. Harrison, I'm curious, with your obvious understanding of the law, why didn't you pursue legal training? Rick smiled. Judge, I found I preferred dealing with historical objects to legal briefs. Each item that comes into my shop has a story, just like each case that comes into your courtroom. I just chose a different way to discover those stories. The judge nodded appreciatively. Well, if you ever decide to take the bar exam, I think you'd make quite the attorney. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Rick, asking how he had developed such unexpected legal skills. People see me on TV and think they know everything about me, Rick explained. They forget that running a pawn shop in Las Vegas means dealing with complex regulations, contracts, and occasionally, lawsuits. I've spent thousands of hours studying business law, not because I wanted to be a lawyer, but because I needed to protect my family's business. The case became something of a legend in Las Vegas legal circles, the day a reality TV star outmaneuvered one of the city's top law firms. For Rick, however, it was simply another day of using his knowledge to protect what he had built. In the pawn business, you learn to look beyond the surface, he told a reporter as he left the courthouse. Whether it's a rare coin, an antique gun, or a legal argument, the real value isn't always obvious at first glance. The lawsuit that had threatened to damage Rick's reputation instead enhanced it. In the weeks that followed, business at the gold and silver pawn shop increased significantly. Customers would often ask Rick for legal advice, which he politely declined to give. I'm not a lawyer, he would remind them with a smile. I just play one when I have to. As for Judge Miranda Holbrook, she became known for a new saying in her courtroom whenever a lawyer underestimated an opponent. Remember the Harrison case? It was her way of reminding everyone that expertise comes in many forms, and assumptions about someone's capabilities based on their profession or public persona often prove wrong. The judge who had once mocked Rick Harrison had become one of his most unexpected admirers. The most significant outcome, however, was less visible to the public. Rick used his courtroom victory as an opportunity to establish a legal education fund for small business owners in Las Vegas, helping them gain the knowledge to protect themselves without having to rely on expensive attorneys. Sometimes, Rick explained at the fund's launch, the best way to fight back isn't with money or connections, it's with knowledge. Looking back on the case years later, Rick would describe it as one of the most important moments in his career. Not because of the victory itself, but because it reminded him and everyone else that true expertise isn't about titles or degrees. It's about dedication, continuous learning, and the wisdom that comes from years of real-world experience. In the end, the judge who had mocked Rick Harrison didn't just learn about his unexpected legal brilliance. She learned an important lesson about looking beyond appearances to recognize genuine knowledge and skill.